This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com, where you can create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
Well, Arthur, here we are again. Same war, same argument, same two men who actually knew how to fight one. Last time we spoke about this conflict, I believe I made several excellent points about decisive military action and the necessity of bold leadership. You made some very reasonable points about caution and restraint, and then everything I predicted came true. So thank you for coming back.
What you predicted, if I recall correctly, was that decisive force would create political reality. 73 days later, the decisive force has created a $29 billion bill, a global energy crisis, and a ceasefire the American president himself describes as being on massive life support. If this is your idea of prediction coming true, I shudder to think what failure looks like.
I said the initial strike was brilliant, and it was. 900 strikes in 12 hours. They killed the supreme leader. They destroyed missile batteries and air defenses across the entire country. That is textbook decapitation. That is Austerlitz from the sky. The problem, Arthur, is not what they did on February 28th. The problem is what they did on March 1st, which was absolutely nothing useful.
The problem is rather more fundamental than that. You cannot decapitate a government and then express surprise when the successor government does not immediately surrender. They killed Khamenei, and his son was appointed within hours. The regime did not collapse. It hardened. Every military planner who has studied this region for the last 40 years could have told them that, and I suspect most of them did.
And this is where you and I see the world differently, Arthur. You look at this situation and you see confirmation that the war should never have been started. I look at this situation and I see confirmation that the war should never have been stopped. They launched 900 strikes and then started negotiating. Do you know what I would have called that in my day? I would have called it an invitation to be humiliated. And that is precisely what has happened.
What you would have called it in your day is largely irrelevant, given how your day ended. But let us address the question at hand. Is this war winnable? I submit that it is not, because the word winnable requires a definition of victory, and no such definition exists. The stated objectives have changed no fewer than 4 times. First, it was regime change. Then it was destroying the missile program. Then it was nuclear disarmament. Now it is reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Each objective is more modest than the last, and they are achieving none of them.
I will grant you that the objectives have been poorly managed. That is not the same as saying the war is unwinnable. It means the war is being won by the wrong people. Iran is a country that was already on its knees before the first bomb fell. Their economy was shattered by sanctions. Their people were in the streets protesting. Their regional allies had been systematically dismantled by Israel over the previous 2 years. This was a country begging to be finished, and instead of finishing it, America launched a magnificent opening campaign and then sat down at a table in Islamabad to ask politely if perhaps Iran might consider surrendering at some point in the future.
You speak of finishing a country as though that were a simple logistical exercise. I have some experience with occupying hostile territory, and I can assure you it is not. But even setting that aside, your argument requires ignoring what Iran actually did in response. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. They launched strikes on 6 Gulf Cooperation Council member states. They hit American bases, Kuwaiti civilians, Bahraini residential buildings, and Emirati oil infrastructure that will not be fully operational until 2027. They turned a unilateral American strike into a regional catastrophe affecting dozens of countries. And you call this a country begging to be finished?
Yes, that is exactly what a cornered animal does, Arthur. It lashes out in every direction because it has no strategic options left. Iran did not close the Strait of Hormuz because they are strong. They closed it because it is the only card they have left to play. And it is working, not because it is a good card, but because the Americans are too frightened of gasoline prices to call the bluff.
Consumer prices in America have risen 3.8%. Oil is above $100 a barrel. The president's approval ratings have cratered. He is flying to Beijing this week to meet with China's leader, while an advisor to the Iranian supreme leader publicly mocks him. And you believe the correct response to this situation is further escalation?
The correct response to this situation is to stop pretending you are fighting a war when you are actually running an auction. The Americans are blockading Iranian ports. The Iranians are blockading the strait. Both sides are shooting at each other during what is supposedly a ceasefire. The American president calls this massive life support and then reportedly considers resuming major combat operations. This is not strategy. This is a man who started a duel and is now surprised that his opponent is shooting back.
That is actually rather well put.
Thank you, Arthur. I do have my moments, as you know from personal experience at several engagements you would prefer not to discuss. But here is my central point. This war is winnable if, and only if, the Americans are willing to commit to what winning actually requires. Seize the Strait of Hormuz with ground forces. Physically occupy the choke points. Stop negotiating from a position of political anxiety about domestic fuel prices and start negotiating from a position of absolute military control over the most important shipping lane in the world. Iran cannot survive a full blockade for more than months. Their economy was already broken. Finish breaking it.
And now I must steelman your position before I demolish it, which I do only because intellectual honesty demands it, and also because watching you nod along approvingly while I describe your own argument better than you did brings me a certain grim satisfaction. Your strongest case is this: Iran is genuinely weak. Its military infrastructure has been severely degraded across 3 rounds of strikes in 2 years. Its regional proxy network has been dismantled. Its economy cannot sustain prolonged conflict. Its new leadership lacks the institutional authority of the dead supreme leader. And the Strait of Hormuz, while a powerful lever, is a lever that also damages Iran's own allies and trading partners, most notably China, which is Iran's largest oil buyer and which has already expressed displeasure about Iranian attacks on Chinese-owned vessels. In theory, sufficient American commitment could force Iranian capitulation, because Iran simply does not have the resources to outlast a fully committed superpower. That is your best case, and I acknowledge that it has internal logic.
Beautiful summary, Arthur. Now I shall do you the same courtesy, and I assure you I will be very fair about it, because I believe in presenting the strongest possible version of a wrong argument before explaining why it is wrong. Your position is that the war is unwinnable, because victory has never been defined, and an army that does not know what it is fighting for cannot know when it has won. You would argue that even total military dominance over Iran produces a political vacuum that the Americans have no plan to fill, no allies willing to help fill, and no domestic political support to sustain filling. You would point to the fact that every stated war aim has either been abandoned or reduced, that the ceasefire is collapsing, that the diplomatic situation has handed leverage to China at the worst possible moment, and that the American president is now trapped between resuming a war the public does not support and accepting terms the Iranians will not offer. It is a coherent argument. It is the argument of a man who has never taken a risk in his life and has been rewarded for it exactly once at Waterloo, and has been dining out on it ever since.
The problem with your case, which I presented generously, is that it requires a country that has just spent $29 billion on a war to then spend substantially more, to commit ground forces to a region where 13 American service members have already been killed and nearly 400 wounded, and to do so while the president's own party is fracturing over the cost of gasoline. This is not a question of military capability. The Americans are perfectly capable of seizing the Strait of Hormuz. The question is whether any democratic government can sustain an occupation of a foreign choke point while its citizens are paying record prices at the fuel pump because of that very occupation. I commanded armies across the Iberian Peninsula for 6 years, and I can tell you that the most dangerous enemy is not the one in front of you. It is the one in Parliament behind you, demanding to know why you have not yet won.
And this is precisely the weakness of democracies in wartime, which I have always said and which you have always pretended is not true. A war is only unwinnable when the nation fighting it decides it would rather lose than pay the price of victory. Iran understands this. That advisor mocking Trump before the Beijing summit understands this perfectly. They do not need to defeat the American military. They need to outlast the American attention span. And right now, Arthur, the attention span is approximately the length of one news cycle about gasoline prices.
So your answer to the question of whether this war is winnable is that it is winnable if the Americans become a different country with a different political system and a different tolerance for casualties and cost. That is not a strategy. That is a wish.
My answer is that wars are won by leaders who impose their will on events, rather than allowing events to impose their will on them. The American president launched the most audacious first strike since I crossed the Alps, and then he stopped. He stopped because of politics, because of fuel prices, because of opinion polls. He had Iran on the floor, and he let them stand back up and close the door to the world's oil supply. If you start a war, you must finish it. If you cannot finish it, you must not start it. What you must never do is start it, stop it, blockade it, ceasefire it, and then fly to Beijing to ask the Chinese president for help ending it. That is not war. That is theater.
And theater is precisely what you specialized in. You marched into Russia with 600,000 men because you believed decisive force creates political reality, and you marched out with fewer than 100,000. You are the living proof that wars begun on ambition and sustained on momentum end in catastrophe.
Russia is not Iran. I faced winter, starvation, and a continent united against me. The Americans face a broken country that lost track of its own minds in the strait.
And yet that broken country has the American president on life support. Your brilliant decisive war has produced exactly what every one of your brilliant decisive wars produced, a mess that someone else has to clean up.
At least I had the courage to finish what I started.
You finished on an island.
2 islands.
That is not the defense you think it is.
It absolutely is not, but I admire my own honesty.
If you have enjoyed watching 2 dead men argue about a war that neither side seems able to end, please like and subscribe. I am Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, and I defeated this man at Waterloo with superior planning, disciplined execution, and no need whatsoever to invade Russia for dramatic effect.
And I am Napoleon, Emperor of the French, and I reshaped the legal and political systems of an entire continent, while this man spent his post-military career arguing against letting Catholics vote. Like, subscribe, and visit philosopherstalk.com to watch Arthur purse his lips in disapproval at everything interesting that has ever happened in human history.
At least I had lips to purse. You had a hat.
It was a very good hat.